nice to see all of you, well, see all of your names here and to connect with all of you here today. So today we are talking about dealing with job change to finding your purpose. Now, I don't think I need to go into the number of changes that all of you have experienced during this pandemic, but I still like to find out. Now, from a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being a lot, 0 being not at all, share with me the amount of changes you've experienced. So 10 being a lot, 0 being not at all. Share with me the amount of changes that you have experienced during this pandemic. So share in the chat just so I have an idea. Okay. All right. I'm seeing quite a lot of 7s and 8s. It's with no surprise that this pandemic has brought about a lot of changes. Now, change is part of life. We experience changes normally, but with the pandemic, we've experienced restrictions changing. Now, parents are starting to take on the role of becoming a teacher. The only way we connect with our colleagues is through online. So we've experienced a lot of different changes. I want to share with you today a little bit about change. Now, we are going to touch on job change, but I want to share with you what are some of the normal reactions that you might experience when you go through changes. Secondly, how can you deal with this change? How can you come out of this change being more resilient and develop that resilient mindset? Lastly, how can we go about finding my purpose? So this is a question many people have as they're transitioning into different roles, or maybe sometimes if they've been laid off. How do I find my purpose? I want you to share in the chat, what are some changes you've experienced during this pandemic? Share in the chat, what are some changes you've experienced during this pandemic? Okay, we've got our first one, John, who said wearing a mask. Absolutely, right? Having to take care of our safety and making sure we're staying safe. Winnie said remote learning. Absolutely. You know, I teach as well. And one of the things which I had to adopt was teaching online and trying to engage with students online. You said started your first job. Well, I hope you got to meet your boss or meet your employees, supervisors when you started this first job. I know my brother-in-law who was in New York and started a new job in pandemic. He didn't get a chance to actually meet any of his colleagues in person for almost a year. So I can only imagine. Monica, you said lost of freedom. Okay, so this pandemic has definitely brought about a lot of changes. So some of you may have lost your job. Some are trying to adapt to remote learning. Now, when it comes to changes that we experience, there are different levels of changes. We know a lot about stress now. Catherine has shared quite a lot. Previous speaker has shared quite a lot about stress. But when we look at stress, there are different types of levels when it comes to stress and changes. Some changes are considered less stressful and some are very stressful. So with the Holmes Race stress inventory, stress which is considered less stressful are things like going on a holiday, planning a holiday. Now, you might be surprised to think planning a holiday is considered stressful. Well, absolutely. And especially during this pandemic, it's come about as one of the stresses that we experience in life. Things like moving homes, beginning a new school, or changes in your work responsibility. So these are stressful, but they're considered less stressful changes. Now, on the other hand, we have more stressful changes. So changes in your financial status. So this is more of a negative change than a positive change. Experiencing pregnancy. And the ones which are considered very stressful, changes which are very hard and can create a lot of different types of emotions, things like loss of employment, divorce, or your death of a spouse. Now, death of a spouse, it came up as a number one change, which causes the most amount of stress. So share with me in the chat, what are some emotions you've experienced during change? What do you feel when you experience a change, or some of these changes in the pandemic and uni when you started your first job? What are some of these experiences that you experience? Okay, all right. So I'm having a look here. Kate, you said anxiety. Yes. Diana, you said fear and excitement. Sarah, feeling overwhelmed. Samir, frustration. Yes, absolutely. So a lot of negative emotions, right? In fact, I don't really like to label it negative. These are just emotions, a lot of emotions that we experience. Now, when it comes to change, one of the things, okay, I can see is more of you are sharing feeling hopeless. A lot of these emotions steer along the lines, even though I don't like using the word negative, steer along what we call in psychology negative emotions. But the thing about change is that it can bring a variety of emotions. Sometimes some changes bring about positive emotions. Now, if you imagine the easing of restrictions, how would you feel? Some of you may feel quite excited about this. So it really depends on a few things. How we feel and think about change, how we feel about change, or the emotions which come about will depend on our thoughts. How do we think about it? Excuse me. What are your thoughts? Now, I do a lot of career coaching, and I have dealt with a lot of people who've been made redundant. Now, when they come to me for coaching, I have two sets of employees who come to me. One set, they're really excited and they're happy to be made redundant. Then there's another set who are really gravely affected by this, and they feel they're not sure how they're going to land a different position and what they're going to do after this. So it really all depends on what we're thinking about it. How do we think about this change which is happening to us? The second thing is whether this change is imposed or chosen. Changes which are imposed on us tend to bring about more negative reactions than those which we choose personally. So changes which we choose tend to empower us because they are the ones which we choose. Doesn't mean that they're not stressful, but they tend to leave us feeling more empowered. One thing we know about change, whether it's career change, life change, changes and restrictions, we all go through predictable phases. Now, there was a psychiatrist, Swiss-American psychiatrist called Kubler-Ross, and he studied terminally ill patients, and he noticed that they go through different stages of grief in order to recover and in order to find the acceptance. So this change model was adapted in organizations and in other areas where they found that actually people go through these experiences even in the organization, or even if they're not grieving. So any type of change, people tend to experience these changes. So I'm just going to share a little bit and quickly about this model. So the first stage, when it comes to the ending, if you are losing a position, or if you have been made redundant, you're going through a transition, often the first reactions that I hear is, yeah, I'm actually fine. There's nothing wrong at all. You know, I can handle this. And then there is the shock. Oh my gosh, what has just happened? What am I going to do? And very quickly after is the frustration with the organization. Why was I made redundant? What about the other person? There's even blaming during this stage. So denial, shock, anger are some of the emotions that happen during the ending stage. Now, bargaining may also take place where an individual may start to go back to the organization and say, hey, can I work for another month? Or can I bargain this job redundancy? So this is something which can also take place in the ending. Now, after the message has synced in, after the change has synced in, the anger, the frustration then starts to switch into more of what we call depression. Now, we talk a lot about this. I think you have an understanding about what depression means. It feels, feeling this sense of hopelessness, feeling sad. So some of you who shared, Hanan, you shared hopeless. That is an emotion which comes about from depression. This is when you're going through the change and it's really setting in. Now, after that stage, what we see people experience is they start to develop an understanding. Most people start to understand, why is this happening? Okay, the organization must have been going through some difficulties. There was a profit loss. I understand why they had to do this, or I understand why I'm in this position, or I'm okay with some of these restrictions. It makes sense because cases are going up. You start to develop an understanding here. Now, the one which we want to reach to is acceptance. So this is where I'm okay with what has happened. Now, coming to acceptance doesn't mean that you shouldn't experience any of the others. It's completely normal and natural. And I just want to highlight this, that these 3 stages are what you might be going through when you're experiencing a change or a job loss. So what can help? What's going to move you more from denial, shock, into acceptance? What's going to move you quicker? One of the things is trying to make sense of the situation, trying to understand, why is this happening to me? There was a study which was done by a few psychologists who were interviewed people who had loved ones staying in a hospice. So their loved ones were terminally ill. They conducted interviews over the 6-month period, 12-month period, and 18-month period. Now, what they found was that those who were able to make sense and able to find meaning from it, meaning that they understood why this was happening to their loved ones. Some of them would have said, even justified, saying, oh, he actually had an unhealthy lifestyle, or this may have been the God's or universe's plan. I understand why this is happening. Or actually, I'm glad this is happening because it's taught me a lot about life. So when you try to make sense of the situation, this can be really helpful. So after 12 months, what they found when they interviewed the people and they assessed them for their levels of stress, distress, anxiety, and depression, those who were able to make sense of the situation experienced significantly less distress, less anxiety, and less depression. So trying to make sense of it is really important. Secondly, we've heard so much about this today, about reaching out to your network for social support. Now, I can't emphasize this enough, but there's so much research on this about how social support can positively can help you when dealing with stressful times and change. Now, I'm personally not someone who likes to reach out for social support. So before this pandemic, I consider myself as quite independent. So I like to do things on my own, and I think I can manage it on my own. But this pandemic has definitely affected me in many ways. And one of the things which I reminded myself was social support, reaching out. Started reaching out to my colleagues, started reaching out to my friends, started reaching out to more and more people. And I can say at the end of this pandemic, I've built so many social connections, more social connections than I did before the pandemic. And it's really, really helped. Extremely useful. It's a huge buffer for stress and change. So reach out to your network. Who is your network on LinkedIn? Who is your network in your family who you could talk to? Who are the people who can support you? Okay, so now let's have a look. The third one is developing a resilient mindset. How can we develop a resilient mindset? I'm going to talk a little bit about this. What is resilience and how can we develop a resilient mindset? Now, the fourth one is have a renewed plan or goal. So important. When you've reached that stage of acceptance and you realize what has happened, it's important to go into, what is my plan now? What am I going to do? Doesn't have to be big plan. Set a plan for the next month. What am I going to do? I'm going to send out 20 resumes or send out my CVs to 20 people. I'm going to connect to 5 new people every week. What is that plan? What is your new goal? So coming to developing a resilient mindset. Firstly, what is resilience? Now, in order to define resilience, there are 3 components to resilience, okay? The first one is you need to experience something which is challenging and negative. Yes, you do. You really do need to experience something which is challenging and negative. You can think about it similarly if you were to go to the gym. Now, if you wanted to build muscles, right? In order to build muscles, you don't just have a light dumbbell and bring this up and down. That's not going to help. You need to start putting on weights. You need to challenge your muscles, right, in order to build that muscle. So the same thing when it comes to your mind. You need to, part of resilience is actually experiencing a challenging and negative event. So if you are going through something challenging right now, great, because this gives you an opportunity to build your resilience. The second criteria is that the person needs to bounce back. You need to bounce back from that adversity, because if you're stuck, that means that you haven't developed resilience yet. The third thing is to experience personal growth, some form of growth, some form of learning that you had from this experience. So for example, when I said, oh, I learned that connecting with others was so important. What is that personal growth that you could have from this experience? So to develop resilience, now, Martin Seligman, he's a psychologist who talks a lot about positive psychology and talks about how can we develop a resilient mindset. What they noticed was that people who are resilient had three things, right? Firstly, when they experience a setback, they viewed it as temporary. So they realized that this situation will change. Now, the restrictions, we are in a stage of restrictions, but this is going to change in a few months. They recognize that it's specific to one situation. So I was only made redundant in this particular situation. I wasn't constantly made redundant. It's just this situation. Third, they recognize it's not their fault. So they externalized it. They didn't blame themselves. So people who develop resilience are not going to take the blame for everything. It doesn't mean that they don't recognize when they're wrong. That's not what I'm talking about. What they recognize is that there are other external factors in play in the environment which are impacting them, and it's not always their fault for the setback. Okay, so going into a little bit more about talking about the purpose. Now, I want to share with you something that you may have already heard, the Great Resignation. We hear that in US, 4 million people voluntarily left their jobs. Now, I want to ask you a question. Why do you think people are leaving their jobs? Share in the chat, why do you think people are leaving their jobs? Okay, you can share it to everyone as well if you like. I'm getting some of personal messages here. All right, so let's see. Clarissa, you said the pandemic made them realize what's more important in life. Absolutely. So made them realize what is important, and maybe working long hours is not the end, right? Nicole, you said horrid pay, long working hours, not enough manpower. Exactly. Almar, toxic work environment. Lime, you said unhappy, bad boss. Jamie, no purpose. Kate, unethical. So yes, a lot of different, I see a lot of themes around not being happy with the environment, toxic work environment, life is too short. So let's see, now a survey which was done found that 42% said that they wanted higher pay. 34 and 32% wanted some form of flexibility. But what is interesting here is that 1 in 4 people want a job with more purpose. So how can you find your purpose? Now, this is a question which many people ask or go through their lives wondering, how do I find my purpose? How do I find that thing which I'm meant to do? Now, you may have heard there is a Japanese term called ikigai. Ikigai is a reason for being. Now, ikigai has 4 areas, right? In order to have a reason for being and a purpose in life, you need to have 4 things. One is you have to have a love for what you're doing. There needs to be you either have a mission in mind, you have a passion, you're really enjoying what you're doing. The second thing is you need to have the skill set. Do I have the skill set to do what I love? The third thing, there needs to be a need for it. So there needs to be a need, the people around it, either somebody's employing you or there needs to be a need if you're starting your own business. The fourth thing is that you're able to make money from it. Okay, so these things 4 combined enable someone to find their ikigai. You might say, Bhali, that's not easy, okay? But what else is going to help me? And I'm here to share a few more tips. Now, one of the things is knowing what gives you fulfillment and meaning. Okay, so I know when I actually started learning about psychology at a very young age, around the age of 16, 17, because I went to personally see a psychologist. And this led me into the career of feeling, wow, it's so interesting. And I really want to help others. And this is what gives me meaning. So knowing what gives you fulfillment, knowing what gives you meaning is going to be helpful. Going through an adversity. So don't shrug off the adversity which you're going through. People have found their purposes through going through adversity. They're able to find a meaning through it. Thirdly, you enjoy what you're doing. When you're doing it, you're in the flow. So many artists who I talk to are people who move into, mind you, not just artists, but also other areas. Whenever they're working, or maybe if they're speaking, they're in the flow, they're in the moment, right? Fourthly, you've got to try. You can't find out what your purpose is just by sitting down and thinking about it. You have to try different things. So when I started my company, Corporate Wellbeing, I was invited to do trainings in many companies. Now, one of the trainings I was invited to develop from scratch was a leadership training. Now, I love leadership. I love the research. But when I developed and delivered it, I felt it was so unaligned to me. And because I tried that, I knew then what I wanted to focus more on, which was well-being in the workplace. Fifth, you've got to start somewhere. So I want you today, right now, jot down what is it that you need, where are you going to start, and what is it that you are going to do today? Okay.